In lieu of Abe being here as Masters of Ceremony, I am instead, and I am very happy to introduce Richard Vachula, and I'll let him introduce himself.
All right, well, thanks. So thanks for coming, everyone. My name is Richard. I'm an assistant professor at Auburn University, but I've been working up here on a second stewardship fellowship from the Skudik Institute. And so I'm going to talk today about a project that's sort of I'm in the middle of. And so I'm looking forward to kind of getting your feedback on, what are the potential management implications of what I'm working on. There are questions that you are interested in that are sort of, you'll see there's like a central focus of what I'm doing that's really relevant to my research program. But I suspect there are sort of spin-offs that might be more relevant and important to all of you. And so before I get started, let's see if these slides before I get started, I did just want to mention a lot of this work has been done by one of my graduate students, Emma Anderson, who's working on her master's with me. And so here's the plan for today. So I'm going to start with some big picture background and motivation. What are paleofire records? If that's the first time you've heard that term, I'll explain it in a few minutes. And I'm going to start off really with why you should care about them and why we should care about them. And then the bulk of my project is actually thinking about how we interpret these paleofire records. And then I'll wrap up at the end with some ongoing work and goals for the project. But along the way, please feel free to just stop me with any questions, comments, etc. I sort of realized, like, usually I'm talking to my own research group about this stuff, and we all work on this, which is not the case here, right? And so I'm probably going to stumble and forget that you don't know what I'm talking about at various points. And so please do feel free to stop me. So let's get started. I thought I would use this recent fire as a bit of motivation. So the Island Falls fire in 2020 cost up to or more than $100,000. Subsequently, someone was actually charged for illegal disposal for lighting this fire. But at the same time, this was not the only fire in 2020, and that fire season was pretty big in Maine. And so more than 1,100 fires burned in the 2020 season, second highest annual total since 1900. And that is up from the previous median of 522. This is reflecting a broader trend across the US. So here are 4 images of important fires that I've looked at in my own research. I'm going to talk about 2 of them. Very briefly, the top is a photo of a campfire in California. Top right is Gatlinburg, Tennessee. The bottom right is the Great Dismal Swamp on the border of Virginia and North Carolina. And then over here is the Acadia River fire in Alaska. And so I'm just going to talk very briefly about the Camp Fire, which did go on record as being the most destructive and costly wildfire in California's history. This is also reflected in a broader national trend, right? So here you can see the budget of, or the cost of wildfire within California for California, state level agency. But across the US and all of US Forest Service land, right, this is steadily rising with each new year. And so, often the focus of fire research in the US is on the West. There's some good reasons for that. This is a fire you may not have heard as much about. And so this is the Acadia River fire, which burned in northern Alaska. So this outline of Alaska is, you can see this, what's called the North Slope. So here we have the Brooks Mountains, and then, it's just email, sorry. So here we have the Brooks Mountains, and then sloping up into the Arctic Sea up there is actually sea ice. You can probably see in that image. And that black spot is the Acadia River fire scar. And so that's roughly 1/3 of the size of Rhode Island, which is our smallest state, but it's still a pretty big area. And this directly emitted permafrost carbon stores in the soil into the atmosphere as CO2. And for decades, it was thought that these tundra ecosystems, which is what this was burning, just did not burn. So the ecology suggested there were no fires in tundra ecosystems, and yet these have started to become much more common. And so this broader trend, right, of these fire events that occur, or these fire seasons, right, that occur, is becoming more common. One quick note too, if you've been to this area of the tundra, you'll know that usually this is really wet. So this person is wearing what looks like Crocs. Their socks are definitely getting soaked there, right? But that is usually like a cap of very wet soil and moss on top of the permafrost, right? And so this really dried out in the summer of 2007 to burn in a very anomalous way climatically. And so with all of these sort of unprecedented events and seasons that are breaking records, right? Typically, there are three genres of questions that come up. The first is how will anthropogenic climate change affect fire? Is that what we're seeing here? So is this fire activity in the modern normal for the ecosystem, or is it a deviation from that natural baseline? And then what can we actually do to mitigate this fire activity and manage it? And so that is where paleo fire records come in. And so what's paleo fire record? So in order to think about this, what I'd like you to do is just imagine this landscape, right? So we've got some topography, some vegetation up there, as well as this lake. And at the bottom of this lake, we're collecting sediments. And so over the years and over the decades, the landscape is going to be influxing sediment, and then within the layers of this sediment archive, sort of like the layers in a tree ring, right? We're recording environmental history through time. And so if we imagine this landscape and start setting that vegetation on fire, those fires are going to begin to emit various byproducts up into the atmosphere as well as directly onto the landscape. And so these byproducts are blown up into the atmosphere, they're deposited out on landscapes as well as the lakes themselves, and then they are being washed into the sediment archives, right? And so this is a paleo fire record. It's when we go in and we extract a sediment record and then measure these byproducts within it to understand how fire varied through time. Typically, we're looking at that on either centennial, so hundreds of years, or millennial, so thousands of years on those time scales, although you can do it on shorter time scales if you have higher sedimentation rates. And so what we'll do is we'll go out and collect these sediment cores. And then we have this archive of environmental history or an archive of fire history through time. And the way we do that is by going out and coring. So maybe the easiest analogy, and I use this with students a lot, is if you imagine like a cup of pudding and a straw, and you put the straw in the cup of pudding and put your finger on the top and then pull it out, within that straw, you're going to have a sediment core or a pudding core. And that, it's a little more complicated and more expensive, right? But it's basically the same physics, actually, of how we extract the sediment core. And so we can do that on rafts, or if the lake freezes over, going through the ice is probably the easiest. And so then what we'll do is along the length of that core, we'll use what are called geochronological techniques. So radiocarbon dating, typically near the top, we can use things like lead-210 and other radiogenic isotopes that fall into the atmosphere. But along the length of the core, what we'll do is date various intervals and then project that depth dimension into time or age. And so at any given point then along the length of the core, we have a rough estimate of how old it was or when those sediments were being deposited at time. And then what we'll do is measure the proxy. So how do we do that? What I'm showing you here is actually a photograph of a charcoal particle. And so it's a little bit more easy to visualize what this is encapsulating. We think about fire as like a chemical reaction. And so if you're in the Scouts, you might have seen this figure, right? So this is what we call a fire triangle. And what it depicts is that to have a fire, you need three ingredients: fuel, oxygen, and heat. Right? And if we were to write this out into a somewhat simplified chemical equation, right? Over here, we've got biomass of some kind, heat, and then oxygen, so those three ingredients. And then on the way out, we have residual carbon, carbonaceous oxides, so those are mostly gases, and then water vapor, right? And so it's this residual carbon that we're really looking at as it's being produced by these fires, being blown up into the atmosphere and then being preserved within these sediment archives. And so if you're a chemist, you might look at this and see it's not balanced, right? The reason is that there's hardly ever enough oxygen to burn everything completely. The way to think about this is when you burn a match, right, there's always that leftover charred matchstick, even if you're like blowing on it, right, and providing enough oxygen. And so this residual carbon, we call that black carbon because it's black and because it's mostly carbon. But black carbon is sort of a catch-all term for a very complex range of different byproducts. And so these are all different byproducts that I've measured in sediment records to reconstruct fire history. So at the smallest end, we have molecules. These have a lot of similarity with pollution particles or pollution molecules rather. And so like, for example, these PAHs or polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are a very rich group of molecules that are built up of different benzene ring configurations, are also produced by, say, diesel engines. So those are also in the environment. Soot would be the same way. On the higher end of the size spectrum is charcoal. And so that's mostly what I'm going to be talking about today. And so generally when we think about charcoal in a paleo fire context, we're thinking about particles that are greater than 150 microns or so. And so 1,000 microns is the width of a millimeter, right? And that's about the width of a human hair. And so we're thinking about like about 1/10 of the size of human hair, the width of a human hair in terms of size. And so going back to this framework, what we'll do is along the length of the core, take out samples. What we do then is digest them very lightly and then sieve them. So we've got sort of like pasta colanders, right? We're sifting through at very small scales and isolating particles that are greater than 150 microns, for example. And then what we'll do is like put them under a microscope and then count them. We can also do a few other things. We'll end up at the end with a proxy record of these charcoal particles through time along the length of the core, or by extension of that geochronological framework, right, through time. And so just to give you an idea of like what these actually look like, this is a microscope image that one of my graduate students took last week. This is actually a sample from Florida. But you can see here, and the scale is a little bit muddled, but this is a 100 micron scale. And so each one of these black particulates is a charcoal particle. And so they come in sort of all shapes and sizes. I don't know if you're like thinking about how much fun my graduate students are having, they like spend hours a day counting these and classifying them. And it's sort of like, yeah, it's within a week, they know whether or not they like it, right? But if you enjoy this stuff, it's a lot of fun. And you can sort of see the vascular shapes that are preserved within these particles, right? And so those are actually quite informative because we can tie them to fuel types. And so in the broadest sense, when we construct these proxy records, right, we have a general record of how much fire happened through time. So if we have more of these particles, we know there was more fire. We have less, we know there's less. But in looking at those particulates, right, we can also start to differentiate fuel types that burned in the past. And so here's one example of, in the lab, what we'll do is take a plant sample and then combust it. And then a lot of the vascular structures of that plant are preserved. And so you can see these same leaves on the left side are nice and green and lush. And then after we get through with them in the lab, they look like that. But similarity there. And these are sort of bigger particles, but as they break down, they actually retain characteristic or diagnostic shapes between different fuel types. And so this is a paper one of my students and I were working on a few years ago, but we were looking at tundra plants. And what we were able to see is that the shapes of graminoid shrubs and then sort of forbs and shrubs all had unique characteristics. And so going back through time, we were able to look at those and say, oh, this is a different plant that was burning. Or in aggregate, right, we have more of this type of plant burning relative to another type of plant burning. So that's sort of like very qualitative. We can also quantify these things. So looking at the length to width ratio of particles, for example, ends up differentiating graminoids from non-graminoids. There's also much more like systematic ways to go about it. So this is I like refer to these as taxonomic keys. That's not exactly what they are. But these are keys that we use to sort out morphotypes of charcoal that have been tied to different fuel sources. And so, like, looking back at this now, right, you can sort of see how we could pull a lot more information out of this than just counting. Right, it's there's a lot that can be done, I guess. And so to return to this point, right, so even though we kind of get like a vague idea of how much fire is burning at any given time, we can also pull out fuel types and things like that through Earth's history. And I put this up here because I think, I suspect that you're all maybe looking at this and saying, oh, that's interesting, but like on your end, that's not all that informative, right? So like if there was more fire vaguely, that doesn't help you, right? To put this into other terms, right? So I'm now going to talk about how we actually can interpret these things. But I'm going to give you a paleofire record. And so this is one that I constructed a few years ago. It's from Swamp Lake, which is located within Yosemite National Park in California. And so it's a little different there. There's way more fire than is occurring in Acadia. But through time, so on the Y or the X-axis here are years in the town era, so 600 CE towards present, towards the right. And then on the Y-axis is the influx of charcoal particles, so charcoal accumulation rate or char through time. And so all I'm telling you now is, right, that here's a paleofire record, here's where it's from. And that doesn't tell you all that much about what that means in terms of area burned, right? And so in terms of interpretation, right, if this is like now in space, you've got your location. If this charcoal record is recording area burned within a kilometer, within 10 kilometers, and within 100 kilometers, right? It's really important to know what that spatial signal actually is for it to mean anything. So that's really what my project is about here in Acadia, is to try to look at and better understand paleofire records within the Acadia space, what they're recording in terms of fire history. And so in order to kind of get at this, I'm going to give you a bit of a crash course in how we think about these paleofire records with some background. And so for quite a while, there was this, what I've called the conceptual model of charcoal dispersal. And so this posited that there were two components of charcoal delivery, one being more like regional, so sort of a low intensity, a low influx of long transported material, and then a more localized input source, right, that would have a much stronger signal. The main tenet of this, right, is the idea that the dispersal of these particles is size dependent. So if you have bigger particles, they're not going to travel as far as the smaller particles can. And then the last point is this idea that the dispersal distance exponentially decays. So as you're getting further out, you're getting less of a signal no matter what. And so, importantly, this model was developed in the late 80s. And so it's been around for a while. It's based on diffusion. And so it was actually developed for trench warfare in World War I to look at how mustard gas was moving around in Europe. But there are a few problems with it that I've identified. One is that it sort of assumes there's a normal distribution just based on the physics that's behind it, which is maybe good, maybe bad. The other thing is that it tends towards a localized signal. What I mean by that is just based on the model physics, right? Because it's treating everything as a parcel of air. They don't go very, those parcels don't go very far because it's diffusion that is driving the process. And so a few years ago, and I'll mention too, so there is support for this at smaller spatial scales. And so this is empirical data that's then corroborated by this physically based computational model. And so a few years ago, I sort of took issue with this model, and mainly because I was puzzled by why you would think about parcels of air as particles. And it just didn't quite make sense to me. There was also, I was looking at empirical comparisons on broader spatial scales, and that model never matched. And so what I sought out to do is to develop an alternative model that's kinematics based. And what I mean by that is it uses, or it treats these particles as projectiles in space. And so you've got a plume that is locking up these particles into the air, and then wind is just like shooting them out into the atmosphere for them to fall out. And importantly too, what we're able to do within my model framework is start manipulating things like particle shape, size, and density, which in the other one, you can sort of tell it a size, but it actually is assuming it's a sphere. Or not even really, it's treating it as a parcel of air that implicitly is a sphere. And so here is like what the result of my model looks like. It's very similar to that earlier computational model that is diffusion based. But what I'm not telling you here is that in this case, we're using particles that are spherical. And then over here, we can input asphericity, which then you'll see is not as clean of a picture, right? But when I showed you those charcoal particles, were any of them spheres? No. And so you probably know that's not how these particles are actually behaving. And so in this sense, what my kinematic model shows us is that size matters, right, in terms of the overall dispersal mechanics and the footprint that we're getting within any given paleophile record. But including shape also sort of makes things messier, and we need to think about that. And so one example, if we start implementing different size parameters that are diagnostic of, say, wood on the left and grass on the right, we end up with very different dispersal patterns as well. And so in that sense, we're able to back out from these paleophile records, right? If we have more of one fuel type versus another, what that spatial signal might be biased by in terms of the fuel inputs. And so I'll just mention too, that same site from California, what we're able to do is compare the model with GIS data and show that it did do a better job correlating these spatial inputs with broader spatial scales. And so in that earlier example of the diffusion-based model, I was showing you a figure that was on the scale of like hundreds of meters that it was able to replicate observational data. And then here we're able to replicate observational data on hundreds of kilometers. And so all that together suggests, right, that these two models sort of combined can characterize how how these charcoal particles are behaving at both localized and regional scales, but that their behavior is sort of a combination of those two model frameworks. And so that was a lot to cover. And now I'm going to start moving into what I'm doing here in Acadia. And so the thing I want to emphasize is all of what I just talked about there, right? It's sort of like very like blue sky theoretical, right? So there's a lot of models. We look at some data every once in a while, but the way these models are set up is that it's a little computer program. Usually they're in 1 or 2 dimensions. So that's to say, we're just assuming everything is like one linear direction, or we're assuming in a 2-dimensional plane that that's how the world behaves, right? And we know that's not the case. So here in Acadia, what I'm trying to do is to combine modeling and more GIS-focused work to create a more complicated model or a more sophisticated model that will be better informed in terms of what these paleophile records are actually recording, right? So incorporating things like wind data, elevation data, watersheds, things like that, right? Which in these earlier model runs, it's all like much too dinky to do that, really. And so this is like the kind of what I spend my day doing. This is a screenshot of MATLAB. Here's the code. I'm not going to go through it, but I will say that it's becoming much more complicated. So the fun part of this is that I had to get a new computer because I actually was crashing my work one, and it takes like 3 days to run one of these simulations, which is sort of fun. But hopefully you recognize on the left here, right, this is Mount Desert Island, the DEM of it. And so what we've been doing is implementing within the model framework, the DEM is the starting point. And so the whole model space now is like the Acadia National Park and its surrounding area. And then what we're starting to do is implement fires within that. And so on the left here is sort of the model space. On the right is a randomly generated set of fires. So each one of those white points is just like a fire. And what we're doing next is modeling what the dispersal of charcoal particles looks like from those model points. And so that's what this looks like. And so those same model points right now on the y-axis, it's sort of like a meaningless, you can think of it as like numbers of particles per square kilometer, but it's all in the model, so it's sort of fake, right? But it shows you from those individual fires, right, we can look at the sourcing of particles. And so for this, we're looking at particles that are greater than 100 microns. We could look at smaller particles too, if that's interesting.
Were you involving weather and wind in that, or was that just sort of?
Yeah, so there is wind in it in the sense of like it varies in the 360 direction between like 0 and 5 meters per second. But there's no dominant wind direction.
Okay.
And so that's something I'd like to implement going forward. As well as like if there's, yeah, depending on if there are data, right? But it could be as sophisticated as the data are available for it.
So is wind direction calculated with Mars?
What's that?
Is wind direction calculated at the Mars station?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, we have that.
Very limited record compared to what he's, he's
right,
going
just
to, yeah.
a sense of like seasonal patterns of wind direction.
Yeah, you could probably interpolate a lot of some of the, you know, things were
10,000 years ago.
consistent.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of like any guidance is better than what I've got right now.
Right.
I guess, yeah. Or it's very generalized. Yeah, and so that's sort of like what this looks like. Practical experience has sort of told me that to look at GIS data at fire activity and how that varies in space as well, because that ends up influencing things a lot more than you might think. And so with my graduate student, what we've been doing is looking at fire history in the park to think about where are the most sort of like the hot spots of fire activity, what are the types of fires that are burning. So we sort of know that wildfires will produce higher plumes, and as a result, more widely dispersed charcoal relative to, say, prescribed fires or accidental fires that are put out relatively quickly. So what Emma's been doing is looking at the data set of fire ignitions that spans the late 1930s into the early 2000s. And so again, I'm sort of like curious what your thoughts are on this data set and what we've been finding with it. I've been finding it pretty fascinating, honestly. I don't get to work with like real data all that much. I mean, I'm a geologist by training, so I'm usually looking at sediment under a microscope. Right? But what Emma's been doing is looking at clusters. Right? And so if what you did here is to look at all of those points, which are sort of hard to see, right, and then grid them into 1 kilometer clusters.
Where did those points come from? They came from the fire history records, all of the fire reports that we had here. We coded them into GIS based on their lat longs, something occasionally adjusting when we could see they were wrong.
So those include like prescribed fire, you're saying, right?
What's that?
They included prescribed fire, right? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so that's in there. It's a small component.
Yeah, very small here.
Yeah.
But so you got the fire at 47 and you got all these other fires. How
So
are you?
we just took that one out.
Okay.
Thank
you. Thank you.
Most of the ones here are very small.
Very small.
Yeah.
Less than an acre.
Yeah.
Like their points of ignition.
And they seem to correspond largely with where people concentrate.
Yeah.
That's shocking to me.
Because most of them are human.
Exactly.
So how do you tease that out in the paleo record? Like the difference between one large event overshadowing or kind of masking several small events? I mean, I would think that that would be not a flaw, but a challenge in trying to establish the history and time.
Yeah, you're very right. It is a challenge. So, we're not really we sort of look at like the aggregate amount of that fire activity in like 5 years, maybe.
Yeah.
What we can look at are, there are a few indices of these shapes of particles where, strangely, if they're more rectangular, as well as if like its area to perimeter ratio, those two indices have been tied to more intense fires. And so that usually correlates to size too. And so there's a little bit of like insight we can get out of that, but not as much as you might think. This comes into play a lot when if we're looking 1,000 years ago when, it would have been mainly Native Americans impacting the landscape in terms of anthropogenic impacts. And that within my research field is like maybe the biggest conundrum actually is how we can tease out like is what we call more like ancient human impacts from the natural fire history.
Is there any benefit in really investigating our really recent record here? Like, can you look at that, and because we know, you know, the dates, you know, the fire intensities, and using that as kind of a ground truth thing to, you know, where you kind of know what the history is, exactly. And see what you find.
Yeah. Yeah, so I was looking at these clusters, and then the next slide, right? So then what she's also been looking at is the size distribution. And so these are, for each of those points, there's a buffer that was installed that is sized relative to its actual size, but it's not to say that that was the size of area burned, right? But that 1947 fire is like the whole thing, so we just cut it out. And so it's sort of interesting to toggle between the two of these, right? Because you do get this concentration of ignitions on the eastern side of the island. But then in terms of size, it's not all that pronounced. And then the other thing that we've started to look at are water. So what this looks like at the watershed scale, specifically not so much for the lakes, but for intertidal zones. Right? And so it's interesting in that when we divide out the number of fires that are being ignited across watersheds, it's not as though there's like this big signal in the east because of the way everything divides out. And so that I suspect might be important to think about. You know, in particular, I think that a lot of sort of marine ecology doesn't think about what's coming in from the land, but increasingly there is work that has shown that as you're burning fires on the landscape, that changes the nutrient dynamics coming into the intertidal zone, and that could have some interesting impacts on marine life there. And so what we're beginning to do then is to take the model end of things, so looking at within the space, right, how far are these spatial signals looking like from individual fires, and then implementing it into this GIS framework, right? And so this is a map of all of those same ignition points, but with 1 kilometer buffers around them. And so sort of showing the hotspot density of likely particulate sort of budgets across space on the island. And so in terms of next steps, what we're hoping to do is start to implement all of these different packages, right, and putting all of this fire history data directly into the model. And so this is sort of like a teaser of what hopefully I'll be doing like next week actually. To then look at, okay, over the historical period, we know what happened in terms of fire history. And then what does that look like in terms of the spatial distribution of these particulates? And then as we collect paleofire records, or if we can compare them with existing paleofire records, right, then we'll be able to say, okay, this is roughly the spatial footprint that that record is encompassing, and what that means going back further in time when we don't know what happened. And so this is, I think, one of the last plots I have. So we were looking at the ignition sources. And so Emma and I was doing a whole class project on this actually. But what we found was, interestingly, like 40% of these ignitions were caused by smoking, so cigarettes. And I did look into the data, and there's sort of like a decreasing trend towards the present, because this is a long historical data set. So as people were smoking less, those ignition sources sort of decreased. And that is actually mimicked at the national scale too, which is an interesting permutation, or an interesting like note, I guess. But like a few of you have noted, right, most of these are not wildfires, and so the fire signal is really a human one on the island. And so we're looking into how to implement within the model. So with these different fire sources, right, it would be expected then that their plume dynamics are going to differ. So we're looking into how exactly we'll parameterize that within the model framework. It's usually like a heat emission factor that determines how high these particles are being injected into the atmosphere. And so we'll try to implement this and then create sort of a historical data set of likely charcoal distributions across the island. And so, yeah, that's like the plan, is hopefully we'll make this more sophisticated make it informative, maybe to identify where good sites would be to get like a full island signal, for example, or if you'd like a very small spatial signal for like an ecological reconstruction, you could look into that as well.
Great man.
And so with that, hopefully like my main point, or my main mission today was to try to tell you a bit about how we use paleofire research and how we're working on trying to improve the interpretation of paleofire research. And then my next steps are to keep working on this. But then I also have questions for you, and we've sort of talked about some of these already, but I would really welcome any questions or suggestions that you have of how this sort of work could be useful to any of you in your work. Yeah, with that, I just thank you for your attention and for having me here today, and I'd be happy to discuss this or answer any questions you might have.
The other thing about the fire history data set was that that is only federal records and anything that the Park Service would have sent people to. So the private areas, NDI, are not really necessarily complete record. It's just in the park or any place they had mutual assistance.
So it's like burning a brush off. Is accounted for or not, like a private landowner?
We wouldn't have a record of it.
But the state would, should, right?
If it was out of control.
Right.
If there was a call out for it, somebody would have it, maybe still.
Permanent response.
Well, yeah, the sponsor is the point of the permit too.
Yeah, assuming that they actually issued them back in 1937 or whenever the record starts. So
Permitting on fire.
So like the model that you're using, that's different than like the diffusion model that you talked about, like how many people are using what you're using? Is it just you? And so a lot of what we know is based on this older model that tends to assume a local signal.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say it, I mean, it's me and one of, that other model is one research group too.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it's, and I don't think, I know the guy that made that, it's Philip Ware, he's a fire ecologist in Idaho. And so I think there's sort of, I think applications where that is way more appropriate. And so where he uses it is in the Western US, where typically just the way fire regimes work out, that is a better model. Because the other, and that's something I didn't really talk about, but I would call it like the spatial self-similarity of fire as a process ends up being a very major complicating factor for any of this kind of research. And so those figures I showed from California, that study that I had done, what we had to actually do is look at where is fire actually different on a landscape scale when you start aggregating years on top of each other. Because it turns out that if there's a fire within a kilometer, it might match the same history as within 10 kilometers. And if we correlate those two time series of area burn, they're it's a correlation of 0.9. So how do you tell whether it's that local source or that more regional source or not? And so does that sort of answer your question? So it's, it's not as though there's a huge research effort using that other one versus mine. It's sort of not that many people are using either.
Okay.
But I think and Phil did a bit of work that was looking at a three-dimensional framework, but it wasn't in the same way here. And that was very much computation with space, I guess.
What about fuel type? This is not a fire, we say all the time, this is not a fire
dependent.
thank you, system, but maybe 5,000 years ago it was. How are you thinking about that in terms of understanding, what we want to understand what kind of paleo fire regime we had here, because there's the myth of, people running around all over the landscape burning like crazy. Well, please show me that evidence. Or if there is, oh my gosh, this place burned all the time, and the Peterson argument that this is a fire adapted system, so we need to keep burning it in order to prevent the fire, kind of thing. So how do you because what we have, do you know anything at all of what I'm trying to say? Is anybody?
We have very mixed signals about
Yes.
what our system is about, and we've been
Right.
told. One being that we've had a lot of fire in the past, especially in like the direction of where we're going with climate change. So there was a lot more fire than there is today. Yeah, and the question is that
real?
Is that real or not? Yes, and that was based on paleo work too.
Yeah, but it'd be like very early paleo work, right?
So 200 years ago, paleo work is like, it's like, really?
So yeah, I think in terms of like fuels, like looking at this particle scale changes is maybe the future for that. I think within this model, I'd be interested to look at, and that's sort of another plan of mine, is to look at vegetation distributions, which is sort of hard, right? Because those are constantly changing, and on this time scale, it might not be the same. But we could look at, for example, like if a forest stand is burning versus a meadow, that should have a very different signal in terms of like heat production and subsequently like how far these particles are making it. So there's the potential to do that. But yeah, I think the fuel sources is probably the particle scale stuff. And so I've not talked about it today, but that's like this. My group's doing a lot of experimental work where it's like pretty dinky, but we basically will collect plants and take them out back of my building. And we have a tin can that one of my students made, and we just burn them in a tin can and we see what gets produced.
My boys, when they were 10 and 7, would have loved to been in your lab.
It's kind of fun. So like, and what we're doing, right, and that's sort of like what a lot of this data. This was actually a lit review, so not most of it isn't even mine, but this is looking at just one index, so the length to width ratio for all these different fuel types, right? What we're doing is using a program that, in addition to length to width ratio, we're collecting something like 10 other variables. So like rectangularity, all these different shape indices and morphology indices. And I'm not sure what we're going to find, but I'm hoping we'll be able to distinguish more than like graminoids versus woody fuels. Try to get at sort of more diagnostic signatures from these paleofire records, like when we're looking at an image like this, to be able to say, okay, that's like roughly X amount of this fuel type, Y amount of that fuel type. And then also looking at like production rates, right? Because different fuel types are going to have different particle production rates as well. And so that's sort of like a longer term plan of mine, but I think there's potential there. And so that one aspect ratio metric has sort of been adopted by a lot of folks. But there's a lot more other metrics out there. I think, as like the AI trend is really like surging too. I don't know who would give me money to do this, but so like the workflow in my research group is for every sample we look at, we take a photo in the microscope. And all those photos are, I've been working at Auburn for almost 2 years now, and we've got like a couple of gigs of photos, right? But my hope is like long term, you can take all those, feed it into like one of these machine learning systems. And then wouldn't it be amazing if you slap a photo up into that system and then it just like starts identifying everything for you?
Just good as a grad student.
Well, I mean, that's what they're supposed to do.
Yeah, do you think you can identify blueberry field, or like blueberry versus forest field? Because it like blueberry fields were burned to be maintained, right?
Are
Somewhere, and still are, and so like that signal versus natural wildfire of like forest burning, I think would be through the paleo record really interesting.
Probably, yeah. I mean, The other thing, so like if you start looking at the ends here, it's not that many plants. And these are all pulling out of the same field here, right? So in total, there's maybe 100 plants that have been burned and tested. Most of them are in Boreal Canada. And that's just because that's where the folks starting to do this work. So a lot of what I've been doing lately is looking at all the plant types in the southeastern US. Turns out don't really like follow this trend, which is interesting. But yeah, if there was like a specific question you had about one plant type versus another in one location, you could go out, collect samples, and then see what that looks like in terms of distinguishing the two. Yeah, I think it's probably possible.
What about pollen?
Yeah,
Well, that's what I was gonna
Yeah,
bring up,
pull
was
that
the
out.
previous,
that's like
the
more
pollen
classic,
study.
But then you wouldn't know which is burning. So you'll have sort of an aggregate, what the plant composition looked like, but it won't tell you which one of those is burning or not.
Right, but I mean, you might be able to correlate the two.
It might give you you know, a idea of what the landscape might have looked like over time. That was what I was thinking too. And what was, did Patterson do cores?
Yeah.
Way back when? Yeah, I thought so.
And as you know,
Yeah, so
Jacqueline
surprised.
and her students have been doing a little bit of work here too. And Steve Norton has been coring lakes in Acadia for 100 years. So I mean, there are those records, and you know, you can, obviously you see changes across huge time scales, and you see when you see clearing for, colonial settler history. I mean, those signals are there. It's just, yeah. I know what's really super interesting is this. It's like you can't tell what was the scale of fire and whether it was, was it a big fire or a little fire? Those kinds of questions, obviously.
Is that, so from a management perspective, is the area burned that would be the most useful?
I think there's a big distinction in management between big fires and little fires. So I think, a little fire, if you're talking about just management, big fires, you're talking big things on the landscape. Little fires, talking about a couple people on the truck. In my opinion, if you just did big and small.
Yeah, and there's been a lot of research done in the water quality end of things, looking at the burned and unburned watersheds, and how they react to, mercury content, nitrogen, and things like that, both because of the fire and in the period, recovery period as well too. So, and there's some sizable differences in how some of those compounds are being remobilized and things like that. So, yeah, it's really kind of interesting to find out which are the target areas that are burned and how long ago, and how that may be affecting some of the other soil chemistry and consequently water chemistry and everything else. So, and that kind of ties in, I would think, also to your concern about the intertidal as well too, and the inputs into the coast, because depending on where those occurred and then how much other watershed influence there is before it even gets there is going to make a difference too. So
yeah, so didn't you and I discuss that recently? Like I read something, I was asking questions like the difference between like the Cadillac stream and the Hanlock stream.
Yeah,
and there is theorized to be that the fire. Right?
Mm-hmm. It's
the fire is the 47.
The fire.
And part of it is because of the changes that happen in the soil. And part of it is because of the vegetation that's regrowing, the difference between how conifers and deciduous, handle deposition and how quickly, deposition gets into the soil. So it's kind of a multi-step process, but it's all kind of spins off the fire history.
I think it's super interesting, and I keep going so in my head, like I always just kind of replay that question as I listen, and the dialogue is happening, right? So what's the utility of that information? It's certainly a chapter in the book, right, that will help our managers have another desk. There's always going to be more questions, and there's nothing it will ever be completely complete, right? There's always going to be more data to gather or a way to sort of reframe it. So If we're looking to change behavior, so I think you could approach it, if we're looking to change behavior, people behavior, like general community, so the park has messages and messaging, right, to the community at large, as we sit around the table together and we kind of, you know, help people understand these impacts on, right, the landscape, and we can identify this as one of those things, whether it's big or small, or what the residue or the residual effect is over time. That's helpful information to have. It certainly could play into a fire management strategy or a safety strategy with the ignition component of what data you're gathering, right? And sort of they're around where people are, it's not a surprise, but we still have to, there are always new people coming in, so they are, you know, it's where people are, but they're new people that won't ever come back, right? This is their one time at Acadia, so they're gonna make the same mistakes that everybody else has made. So it certainly, I think, could help from a safety component and just sort of a silo of that sort of discussion that helps other people make good decisions, and just this background data that can come out in the relevant way to make better decisions. And certainly, I think as you're talking about what's our strategy around the table, like again, it's a chapter in the book that helps us just have another bit of knowledge that really helps, you know, inform a discussion. So
can I ask that the like smoking ignition sources, is that, I guess I have never heard of that, but like when I think about like fire prevention messaging at parks I've gone to, it's always campfires.
Campfires, yeah, right.
And that doesn't seem, I think.
But they're heavy. I mean, there's some of those seawalls, I think, one of the highlights. The campgrounds where people are.
Yeah, campgrounds on the
right?
periods.
Again, it's where people are, always burning fire, yeah, right? Every night, you know, 30 sites at a time, whatever, however many sites are at. So, and some of those pits, I think, are very much more useful in that way, right? And maybe not as in the scientific discussion, but in the people management, you know, user use discussion.
And although it's less common, you know, the smoking aspect is still there, especially where you are. I mean, I was waiting in line to get into the Common Ground Fair, and some idiot, you know, threw a half-lit cigarette out of the window towards this old grass, and I thought we were going to have, like, you know, all these miles of parked cars, so we're going to be incinerated.
I think also pipes were more common way back in the early part of the record, and with people cleaning out a pipe to start over again. You might have had hot stuff also.
So now maybe their vape pen explodes. Or
Yeah.
Your lithium battery in your drone
Great.
And it's not a mainstream discussion, but the question around how much modification of landscape did Native people do here? I mean, there are lots of places where people burned and managed landscapes at a very large scale, and we don't, there's not very little of any archaeological evidence for that. There's a lot of story, and Native people will say we managed and modified landscapes, and we burned and we did this and we did all of that, but show me the money, honey. I mean, we don't, we see no signature of that in the archaeological record. I would love to have some way to potentially say, what, if you can say something about what is the source of when you see a paleo fire,
and the scale.
But we probably, I don't know that, that's available, but maybe pairing, for example, some of the, say, Baker Island, for example, or some place where we know there is a reasonable expectation that Native people were living and doing something or managing landscape, and pairing that with looking at some of this paleo fire stuff. Some of the stuff that's been done in the past is, well, we're going to go up to the top of Cadillac and we're going to see if people were burning. Well, that makes no sense that people were up there. If you think about the logic of how people manage landscape, but there are plenty of other places where it would make sense to do.
That's why I think the blueberry
Question
connection is really good, because I mean, at least in driving around, that seems to be a fairly regular thing, scheduled. And I don't know how much is really happening large scale down here, on NDI, but certainly on the mainland, And the commercial growers and everything else, it's like I think they do it every other year, depending on how they do things. So there would probably be pretty good records, you know, of if it's a commercial entity that's been there for any long time, as far as, you know, how long they've been doing it. So that might be a really good kind of almost like a test plot, you know, type of situation.
And blueberries are insect pollinated, so they're not represented in the pollen record as well, right?
They might,
I know they're insect pollinated.
yeah, I think the pollen might still end up in there, but
But
it'd
okay,
be less,
but not like
yeah,
trees.
like pines, like, that's any record in the Northeast is like 90% pine.
We didn't shoot any
Yeah.
weeks of yellow blowing across the yard.
Really substantial input or anything, but I'm currently applying for grad schools for paleoclimate and vegetation. It's kind of interesting. I've never seen truffle as a proxy before, and it makes me wonder what my advisors are gonna get me into once I get started. But yeah, I just wanted to say it felt relevant.
Well, yeah, you can come to grad school with me if you want.
If you knew that at the beginning, you would have pitched it very differently.
I mean,
grad students toiling over this.
It's fun, you know, like my college is in, it's the College of Science and Math. So it's something like 70 or 80% of our students are actually pre-med. And are not in, you know, there's 5 or 6 departments, and most of them are in the study program, but they have to do research hours. And so they end up like going, like in the spring, I have a number of these students that have no interest in this research before, like needing to get research hours to go to dental school, right? And then, but they, you know, it's like on day one, I can tell pretty quickly whether or not they're gonna love it or hate it, right? And the ones that really like it, like, you know, they really like it because it's like it's one of the more tangible, like scientific processes out there relative to, like I showed those molecules, and that sort of work is like you're like doing like science with beakers, et cetera, but you don't get to see your results until like a weekend, you know. So for students, it is sort of fun if they like it, but no.
So what's the next step? You're continuing to doing the modeling. Are you gonna be coring any? Are you gonna be
So
doing coring?
yeah, I think like I'm sort of like exploring that
Yeah,
option.
okay.
And so I think I was sort of trying to figure out, you know, if there were target areas. Initially, I had been planning to core Sergeant Mountain Pond with like Jacqueline Gill's group, who also cored that. So we had sort of like a overlap.
Yeah.
What about Isla Ho Long Pond?
Well, that's not a bad idea.
Because Isla Ho is a big question about, like, fire could be
Yes.
catastrophic on Isla Ho because it's so remote and there's a lot of fuel out there. Yeah, and so.
And there's a good historical record of, well, you know, stories of fire, major fires out there. Yeah, that's a great idea.
I just don't know how far back the record would go there.
I don't know anything out there. I'm not sure whether there was anything in the fire reports about fires out there.
We'll point out road,
Which one, the Western Mountain Road? Western
the
Road.
Isle Road, it was too developed because of all the fires.
I don't know, that's possible. I mean, we could look at the history of Idaho, but you're right. I mean, the Rangers have been out there for
100 years.
no, not that long, but the town's been there and there's potential for possibly for history.
Yeah,
That's
It's super cool out there. Everything is more challenging because it's more remote. You have to take a ferry out there and all that. But it's the closest you get to wilderness in this park.
Yeah, and the lake is, you know, fairly decent size, so I mean, it would be a good integrator, I would think.
But whether you've got weather records and reports for Idaho, you know, some of this is the wind and weather records, right? Piece.
Yeah, well, they've had a RAWS station out there for quite a while, so, I mean, I'm sure there's enough. And I mean, it could be, interpolated from, I would think, from buoys and from Stonington and, you know, other nearby sources, so. Yeah, I think that's a really good idea. Because it is kind of like
I
that
don't know if anybody's ever done it
microcosm
before.
Oh, yeah.
type situation.
It's a terra incognita.
Yeah,
Yeah. That's a good idea.
and just interesting to see if it has similar patterns in it as like Sargent Mountain. What if it's completely different?
Right.
Where we like, we can't just like assume that Sargent Mountain is representative of like the entire like mid coast, because I think we tend to just assume that what Sargent Mountain tells us is like what the coast was.
Well, it is May's first lake after all.
Well, with Sergeant Mountain Pond being such a high elevation, would that exclude some of the local sources?
Yeah, or it might be, like biased to bigger fire.
Yeah, that's what I mean. So I mean, it might be interesting to contrast a high elevation versus a lower elevation area too, just to see how that plays out. Because that's kind of like the way we think about it in the deposition end of things, you know, because it's kind of the canary in the coal mine. It's most affected by most of the global influences, whereas it has less watershed effect because it's the high point in most of the water, you know, for a very small watershed. So seeing how that reacts differently to even like the bowl, which is still high, but it's lower than Sergeant Mountain Pond, similar size, you know, or and maybe find a few other catchments that are similarly, you know, spatially similar. Might be a way to look at
Do you want something, would you want something in the tarn related to Great Meadow? River watershed?
it. Yeah.
Well, the tarn,
I know it's
was
artificial.
well, it was
It was a
a,
marsh,
it's a
right?
wetland,
Yeah.
it was a stream.
I would worry that the record is totally garbled by things that we've done to it.
Sure.
Maybe.
What about like Witch Hole Pond or something like that is what I'm thinking.
Jacqueline
Oh, yeah,
Stevens
she
did
poured that one.
cord Witch Hole 2 summers ago.
Okay, and you don't have access to her cord?
Doesn't say you couldn't pour it again, but the question is it, yeah.
Yeah, or it's might be a timeline, so like, yeah, once all that stuff's published, then it's sort of like a free for all.
Okay. Do you need open water, or do you do peatlands? What?
Fawn Pond?
How about Bear Brook,
East of Lincoln?
Good.
Beaver Dam?
I don't know.
That wasn't a pond until it was ponded, was it?
Yeah, that's a good
It wasn't
question.
as big.
And fawn is so small, I wouldn't think it would have much of a, we don't know about the history of the
Well,
record.
what about Lakewood? Yeah.
It's probably like 200.
The website doesn't get as much attention,
True.
right?
Yeah,
That's fun.
it's like Hodgson or something.
That's fun.
I don't know how long it's been there.
Yeah, and like how much is that, like, has it always been, it's like a peatland with a pond in the middle, like, has it always been filling in? Or have there been times where it was peatland? Like, I don't know if it's got a stable record, but like.
It's pretty small.
Yeah, it is pretty small too. What is that?
Round.
Like Echo?
Echo, Round, Hodgson, any of those would be. Probably Echo would
Or
be
Seal Cove?
less. Yeah.
I guess the question is, what are you looking for?
Yeah, like what?
Yeah.
And, you know, right, what's the Goldilocks in your mind?
I mean, for me, even having the sort of the bandwidth to work on this model, I think, and putting it into this, you know, the map, sort of the actual space framework is really valuable for me. And so I'm sort of like, anything on top of that is great. And so like, yeah, like new target areas for new cores is also really interesting to me.
Yeah.
And I guess like, yeah, too often, right, I think like the people that do this paleo fire work are going out and like we just pick like what looks like a lake, you know, in an interesting location. And so if there are like, yeah, like I think this blueberry question would be really interesting to look at, because you're like, you all kind of are interested in that as opposed to me just doing it on my own and then like handing it off to you.
But I think like, so there's been more, really all of the coring has been on the east side of MPI. That's also where most of the people have been, most of the fires have been. And so having a place that's not the east side might give it different information, I think.
Well, I don't know how that would work. I was thinking about Seawall Pond. It's hydrologically connected to the ocean at times, so it's probably brackish and, you know, fresher sometimes and
Not
more brackish.
less than you would,
But it's
less than you would think.
right next to the campground.
What about your beloved
Yeah.
Jordan Pond?
There's tons of cores
There have
there.
been lots of corn
Yeah.
that's been done there.
Upper Hadlock too has been cored.
Mhm.
Steve Norton cored that one.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
The prevailing winds are generally westward here, is that right?
We get
Southwest.
from the southwest in the summer and
From-
storms are northeasterly winds.
Okay. Because I was thinking that could be another interesting thing about doing it on the west side, because
Yeah.
you know, a lot of the debris that would come over would be coming over from across the ocean, seeing how much all these debris can actually spread over long distances.
Yeah.
But that'd be very exciting for you. So,
Well, there was more land exposed, you know, post glaciation as well.
Oh.
The coastline's been drowned since then, which is why we've lost so many cultural sites or native sites because they're underwater.
yeah.
So there's more land surface that could potentially have been vegetated and potentially burned.
Interesting. On the west side.
Well, anywhere,
Yeah.
really. Lots of factors to think about over time.
No.
Here, you know, the change, you know, of vegetation post glaciation, and then the sea level change and a lot of landscapes.
So personally, I think if you're gonna go somewhere new, that Isle of Ho would probably be the most interesting and the most surprises. Like, and a core that other people would use probably for call-in too, just to see, like, I think it would have the most value, it'd be the most work to get.
Yeah, it would be really hard to be out there in the winter.
Yeah,
If
that's
it's
true.
coring in the winter.
Yeah, because the ferry doesn't go
There's
in the
no,
winter, right?
there's really,
Yeah.
there's zero transportation.
Yeah,
We can't support logistically much.
right, but you can core in the summer, it's just not as easy for you.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it depends on, like, if we're just looking to get like an initial sampling, that we can do with like a kayak even.
Okay.
Like an inflatable kayak, and so that's not too difficult, but yeah, if we wanna go for like really long cores, then you need like more of a platform, which involves sort of multiple kayaks lashed together, and like I think in those photos I showed you, that was actually like a whitewater rafting, platform.
Yeah,
Yeah, I mean, the nice thing about Long Pond and Isle of Ho is that the family that owns the north section is super supportive of us using it to get down, like they let us cross their land and even drive on their land to get to where we sample. And I think they seem pleased to know that we do these things and that they let us have access. So getting down to the water would be relatively easy, knowing that you'd be using like Kubotas, not like trucks to transport things, unless the Isle of Ho folks have a truck for us, but.
And there's one canoe that's out there.
Okay, nice. Yeah, if we have lead time, I feel like we can make it happen.
Some stuff could get staged out there with a new boat, maybe.
I think it
You
could
know,
be supported.
earlier in the season.
It would be hugely interesting to the community because